The words pulsed in Grace Walker's mind as she stood on the cracked sidewalk, clutching her trembling 5-year-old daughter Sophie while the rain soaked through her thin jacket. Night had already taken most of the sky, blotting out color, leaving only slashes of headlights and street lamps cutting through the darkness. Sophie's small backpack sat beside a pile of garbage bags, everything they owned cinched tight by Joanne Whitaker's manicured hands only an hour earlier. It had been a home once, a warm, hopeful place filled with pictures, recipes, and memories of Daniel. Now it was just another house with a lock she no longer had the key to. "You need to leave," Joanne had said. "We've done enough. This isn't charity. Daniel's gone. You need to move on. Find your own life. Find her own life." She had wanted to scream that this was her life. She had wanted to ask how you move on from loving someone who will never walk through a door again. But instead, her dignity held her upright, as Ryan and Tiffany helped carry her things out in trash bags like unwanted clutter. She said nothing. She just took Sophie's hand and walked. Now here she was, at the far end of Delmore Street, cars rushing past, faces turning away, because who wants to look directly at a woman losing everything? Sophie tugged her sleeve. "Mama, can we go back inside now? I'm cold." Grace knelt down and brushed a wet strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. Her voice shook, but she forced steadiness. "We can't go back there, baby. But we will have somewhere to sleep tonight. I promise. You promise, 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 promise." But in truth, she had no plan. She had $43 in her pocket, 2 stale granola bars, and 1 exhausted child. She checked her phone, 3% battery. No calls from friends. No messages from anyone. No one coming to help. And that was when it hit her, not fear strangely, but something else. An echo of a memory. A place. A house. Her grandfather's house. A place so forgotten she had barely thought of it in years. An old farmhouse in Everbrook, Montana. Remote. Abandoned. Crumbling, if it even stood at all. Her mother once said it was a house that refuses to die, still standing through storms and time. As a child, she hated how isolated it felt. But now isolation felt like safety. Her mother hadn't paid taxes on it for years, but maybe, just maybe, it was still there. Still hers, technically. Still waiting. She swallowed. Montana, she whispered to herself. Everbrook. Grandpa's farm. It sounded ridiculous, impossible. But suddenly it was the only thing that made sense. 2 hours later, a reluctant taxi driver loaded up trash bags into his trunk. He kept staring at them, at her, like trying to decide whether this was a fare or a life crisis he didn't sign up for. "You sure you want to go all the way out there? It's past the valley." Woods, no streetlights. Cold up there this time of year. "I'm sure," Grace said. Her voice shocked her with how certain it sounded. Sophie nestled in the back seat with her stuffed rabbit leaned against her mother's side, eyelids fluttering between fear and sleep. "And what's up there?" the driver asked as they passed the last gas station on Highway 9. "A house," she said quietly. "That somebody lives in," no, Grace said. "Nobody lives there." The driver raised his brow through the rearview mirror, but didn't ask more. Some silence wasn't meant to be broken. The road narrowed. Trees thickened. Civilization faded. Darkness deepened. And then abruptly, the driveway, if it could be called that. Overgrown weeds. Rusted mailbox with no door. Gravel long consumed by nature. The taxi pulled in hesitantly, tires crunching against broken stone. And there it was. The house. Standing like it had been waiting, its tired bones showing through chipped white paint, its windows dark, its porch sagging forward crooked, but somehow still holding on. A wounded thing that refused to fall. Lady the driver muttered awed, despite himself, that place looks half dead. Grace opened the door. Maybe. But it hasn't given up yet. She stepped out into the cold Montana air. The silence was different than the silence in town. Heavier, deeper, but honest. Sophie blinked sleepily at the looming building. Are we staying here? Grace bent down beside her. If it'll have us. Does it have beds? Maybe not. Is there heat? Not sure. Sophie paused. But it's ours. Grace nodded slowly. It's ours. A faint smile appeared on Sophie's face. Then I think it'll be okay. It was the bravest sentence Grace had heard in her life. They didn't explore much that night. The door creaked open with only slight resistance, as if it remembered them. The air smelled of dust and time. The floorboards moaned when they stepped but held. There was no electricity, no heat except what might be coaxed from an old wood stove. But there was a roof and walls, and maybe in the morning answers. Grace found 2 wool blankets in a closet. Dusty, but warm enough. She lit a flashlight to find a dry corner, spread the blankets, shared one with Sophie, and lay awake while her daughter slept beside her, tired but safe. She had been erased from a house that wasn't hers, but here she could start to exist again. At some point past midnight, the wind howled and the house groaned back like old bones flexing against the cold. And Grace understood. It was broken, but it was still standing, exactly like her. She closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness. This place may be falling apart, but it hasn't given up. Neither will I. A beat of silence. Then faintly, tap, tap, tap. Not from her imagination. From somewhere inside the house. The walls had a heartbeat, and tomorrow she would find out why. That is how her first night ended, cold, tired, but beginning. And in the morning when she opened the front door, someone stood on the porch with a tool belt and a quiet nod. Name's Noah Green, he said. House like this. You either fix it or it buries you. Grace stared at him. The morning was colder than the night. Grace woke to the sound of wind rattling through broken window panes and tree branches tapping against the siding like bony fingers. The weak Montana sun filtered through torn curtains, casting strips of pale light across the floorboards. She blinked into the dimness, unsure for a moment where she was, until she felt Sophie's tiny body curled against her side under the rough wool blanket. It hadn't been a dream. They were here, in the old house, in the middle of nowhere, with no heat, no power, no plan. But somehow there was no panic. Just quiet. She sat up slowly. Her back ached from sleeping on the hard floor. Her right hand was numb. The chill had sunk into her bones. Sophie stirred, rubbing her eyes. Is it morning? Barely, Grace said, brushing hair from her daughter's face. But yeah. Do we have cereal? Grace swallowed. Not yet. Sophie nodded like she understood more than a 5-year-old should. Grace stood and stretched, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Her breath fogged in front of her as she moved toward the front window, cautiously parting the dusty curtain. And there he was, Noah Green, standing on the porch with a battered toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Grace opened the door. Morning, he said, offering the thermos without a smile. Coffee. She blinked. You just showed up. You looked like someone who could use help, he said plainly. Place like this, not safe to try and fix it alone. I don't know if I'm fixing it, she said. He looked past her at the sagging porch, the cracked windows, the ivy creeping into the gutters, then back at her. You planning on letting it fall on your kid? Grace tightened her jaw. Noah shrugged. Didn't think so. She took the thermos and stepped aside, letting him in. Inside the house was no better in daylight. It smelled like mildew and mothballs. The wallpaper peeled in long curls. Floorboards creaked even when no one stepped on them. But Grace saw it differently now. Last night it had been shelter. This morning it was possibility. Noah walked in slowly, like someone stepping into a memory. Walter Walker used to let me fish in the creek behind here when I was a boy, he said. I haven't been inside this place in over 20 years. You knew him, quiet man. Kind. Didn't talk much. Always carried a pocket knife and a flask. The kind of guy who knew how to fix things and when not to. Grace let that hang in the air. She had almost no memories of her grandfather beyond his flannel shirts and his weathered hands. You don't have to help, she said quietly. We're strangers. Noah gave her a glance. You got a kid. You're sleeping on the floor. That's enough for me. They worked together that day. She swept. He reinforced the porch with salvaged wood from the shed. She scrubbed counters. He boarded up the broken kitchen window. The only break they took was for lunch, where Grace heated canned beans on a dented skillet over the wood stove. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Sophie ate in silence at the wobbly table, her stuffed rabbit in her lap. Is he staying? She whispered to Grace. No, honey. Just helping. Sophie nodded like she wasn't sure which she preferred. After lunch, Noah stood back and surveyed their work. You got water running. Brown. Smells like rust. He nodded. We'll filter it. And the roof. Grace winced. Leaks everywhere. I'll bring tarps tomorrow. But this place, it's got a strong spine. Like it wants to keep standing. She looked up at the cracked ceiling beams, at the dust floating through sunlight like ash. And she said it almost to herself. This house may be falling apart, but it hasn't given up. Neither will I. Noah looked at her then. A long, quiet look. Like he finally understood she wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to rebuild. I'll come back in the morning, he said, packing his tools. You need a ladder and someone who doesn't mind splinters. After he left, Grace walked the perimeter of the house with Sophie pointing out the shed, the old chicken coop, the crooked fence half swallowed by brush. Behind the house, a grove of trees hid what used to be a vegetable garden, all overgrown now, but with the faint outline of rows still visible beneath weeds and frost. This could be something, Grace whispered. Sophie looked up. Like a fairy house, Grace smiled. Maybe. That evening, they lit another fire and unfolded sleeping bags. Margaret from the church pantry had lent them earlier that day when Grace walked into town. Grace's feet still hurt from the 10-mile round trip, but she'd gotten dry goods, a bag of rice, and a bar of soap. More importantly, she'd met Delilah James, Sophie's future teacher. The woman had kind eyes and a voice like someone used to calming chaos. We'll get her enrolled, she'd promised. We'll find a way. You're not alone. Grace wasn't sure she believed her yet, but it felt good to hear anyway. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep beside the fire, Grace found herself wandering back toward the basement. The door creaked as she opened it. Cold air whooshed up, smelling of old wood, wet cement, and something harder to name. She held the flashlight steady and took slow steps downward. The beams groaned beneath her. The light flickered, and there it was again, that soft, irregular draft brushing her ankle. She moved closer to the far wall where the bricks looked oddly uneven, like someone had patched it in a hurry. Her fingers traced the cracks. Something was behind there. She pressed her palm flat against the brick. It was cold, too cold. But she didn't try to break it. Not yet. Something about it told her a not yet. She turned off the flashlight, climbed back upstairs, and closed the basement door. Tomorrow would come, and with it questions she wasn't ready to answer tonight. But the house knew. She could feel it. And somewhere deep in its bones, it was holding a secret that had waited decades to be found. A secret that would start to stir the moment the wall came down. The sun rose late over Everbrook, crawling across the frosted hills like it had no place better to be. The sky was wide and bruised with morning clouds, the kind that held snow in their bellies. Grace stood on the back steps of the farmhouse, hugging herself against the cold, sipping the last of the coffee Noah had brought yesterday. The wood stove had kept them warm through the night, but she could still feel the drafts creeping in from every direction. Inside, Sophie was still asleep, curled up like a kitten, under two quilts, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Grace let her rest. There would be no school today. Not yet. She turned and looked at the house, not just at its broken windows or its missing shingles, but at its bones, its shape, the lines beneath the damage. There was something noble in it, like an old war horse waiting to be ridden again. You don't fix a life in one day, she whispered to herself, staring at the cracked foundation. But you can start with one board. As if summoned, the crunch of boots on gravel drew her gaze to the front. Noah was back. He had a tarp rolled under one arm, a bucket of nails in the other, and a steely look on his face that said he'd already decided what today would be about. Grace raised her eyebrows. You just can't stay away from lost causes, huh? He dropped the tarp and shrugged. I don't like to see a house give up, especially not when someone's fighting harder than it is. That was the thing about Noah. He didn't smile often, didn't joke, but everything he said felt solid, like fence posts hammered into the ground. They got to work. First the roof. He climbed while she held the ladder, passing him tools when he called down for them. Grace had never touched a hammer before 2 days ago, but today she drove nails into warped planks with something that felt almost like purpose. The wind cut across the valley. Clouds shifted. The sky stayed sullen and cold, but their hands stayed busy. By noon, Noah had patched the largest holes, tarped the east side, and braced 2 of the porch beams with salvaged wood. While he worked on stabilizing the back deck, Grace focused on the inside. She scrubbed out the old sink with steel wool until the rust loosened. She pulled down moldy curtains, opened every window she could, and let the fresh air slice through the stagnant silence. She found a broom with half its bristles and started sweeping dust and mouse droppings into a cracked dustpan. It wasn't glorious, but it was something. After lunch, another round of canned beans, Grace decided it was time to walk back into town. She had a list: bottled water, candles, disinfectant, and if the food pantry still had it, powdered milk and instant oatmeal. Noah offered to drive, but Grace refused. She needed to walk, to feel her feet on the frozen road, to remember the weight of each step. Besides, she still had pride. Halfway into town, a pickup rumbled past her and stopped. The window rolled down and a woman in her early 40s leaned out, her curly brown hair tucked beneath a knit beanie. You must be Grace, she said. I'm Delilah James, Sophie's future teacher. Grace nodded cautiously. Word travels fast. In a town this size, Delilah smiled. It's faster than the internet. Delilah offered her a ride, which Grace hesitated over for a moment before nodding. In the truck, they talked. Delilah didn't press. She asked about Sophie, about how she was adjusting, about whether she liked books or bugs or both. Grace found herself opening up more than expected. She told her about Daniel briefly, about the eviction vaguely, and about the house not in detail, just enough for Delilah to understand they were starting from scratch. "You're doing more than most," could Delilah said softly. "Most people would have folded." Grace didn't know what to say to that. When they reached town, Delilah dropped her at the church pantry. Inside, Grace found Margaret Evans, who greeted her like they'd known each other for years. "You need warmth?" Margaret asked. "I've got a box of hand warmers and wool socks from a local scout drive. And someone donated a used space heater, old, but it runs." Grace blinked. "That's amazing." Margaret nodded. "People remember Walter, your grandfather. He was quiet but kind. Helped folks without ever asking for thanks. That sort of thing echoes." Grace carried 2 bags back out to the road, stunned by the quiet kindness of it all. Not pity, just help. When she returned to the farmhouse just after sunset, the porch lights, 2 ancient lanterns, glowed with soft battery light. Noah had found them in the shed and mounted them just like her grandfather had once done. Inside, Sophie was awake and coloring on the floor, the fire humming gently behind her. "Did you know we have a secret door?" Sophie said casually, pointing toward the basement. Grace's heart skipped. "What makes you say that?" Sophie shrugged. "I heard it breathe." She giggled like it was a game. But Grace's stomach twisted. Later that night, after dinner, and after Sophie fell asleep, Grace sat beside the stove, staring into the fire, her mind not on flames, but on bricks. That wall in the basement, that strange draft, that sound. She wanted to believe it was just bad insulation. But deep down she didn't. She remembered something her mother once said long ago. A throwaway comment while flipping through a dusty old family album. Your grandfather had a way of keeping things to himself. That house of his has more secrets than walls. At the time, Grace had laughed. Now she wasn't laughing. She stood, moved to the kitchen, and opened the basement door. The steps groaned under her weight. The flashlight flickered once. She reached the bottom and turned slowly toward the wall. No change, no collapse, just the same uneven bricks. But this time she leaned closer, listened. A faint whistle. Not wind. Something else. She pressed her palm flat against the bricks and felt it, a pocket of cold air behind stone. Maybe a space, maybe more. She didn't touch it again. Not yet. Tomorrow. Tonight, she climbed back up the stairs, shut the door, and leaned against it with her eyes closed. The house was speaking, and soon she'd have to answer. Grace hadn't intended to go back down into the basement that night. After a full day of cleaning, hammering, and scraping, all she wanted was sleep. But something tugged at her, something quiet and insistent that crept into her chest like a whisper she couldn't ignore. She waited until Sophie was asleep, curled up under the new quilt Margaret had given them. The fire in the stove was low, but still breathing warmth into the living room, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Grace stood silently in the kitchen, holding her breath as she eased the basement door open. The cold hit her like a wave, colder than it should have been. She flicked on the flashlight. Its yellow beam stretched down the narrow stairs, catching the dust suspended in the air like particles of time. Every step creaked beneath her weight, like the house was groaning in protest. The smell was the same as before, mildew earth, and something older. It wrapped around her like an old coat, heavy and familiar. At the base of the stairs, she paused, sweeping the light across the space. The corners were crowded with rusted tools, broken furniture, and stacks of cardboard boxes that looked ready to collapse. But her eyes went straight to the far wall, the one that breathed. She moved toward it, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The brickwork looked normal at first glance, but now that she was focused, she could see what her exhaustion had missed before. The mortar lines were uneven. Some bricks jutted slightly. One near the center was darker, discolored, like it had absorbed something over the years. She pressed her hand against it. There. A pulse of air. Not a breeze, not wind, something subtle like the way air moves when someone walks past you in a quiet room. "This house is hiding something," she whispered, brushing her fingers along the edge of a loose brick. "And I think it wants me to find it." She leaned in, listening. Her breath slowed, ears straining against the silence. Nothing. And then faint but undeniable, a soft knock. Not from inside the wall, from behind it. She stumbled back, flashlight beam jittering as her heart pounded in her ears. She stood frozen, gripping the light like it could protect her from whatever was on the other side. But there was no second sound, no movement. It had to be the house settling. The wind. The cold. It had to be. Still, she didn't go any closer. Not yet. Instead, she backed away, slowly climbed the stairs without looking over her shoulder, and shut the door behind her with more force than necessary. She locked it out of instinct, even though she knew that whatever was down there didn't need a key. She barely slept that night. The next morning, Noah noticed the change in her before she said a word. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, stepping into the kitchen with a fresh thermos and a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon rolls. "Thanks," she said, taking the bag. It was a long night. He didn't press. That was something Grace appreciated about him. He never asked questions he didn't need answers to. But when she handed him a cup of coffee and sat across the table, she spoke anyway. "There's something in the basement," she said. His eyes didn't widen. He didn't laugh. He just waited. "I felt air coming through a wall," she continued. "Like a space behind it. A false wall. And I heard something." "What kind of something? A knock?" "Just once, like..." She hesitated. "Like someone asking to be let out." Noah nodded slowly. "Could be a sealed crawl space. Old farmhouses sometimes have hidden storage. Maybe a vent collapsed and now the air's funneling through the cracks." "You think I imagined it?" "No," he said. "I think houses remember, especially ones like this." She stared at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sipped his coffee. "You've been through hell. This place has too. You're both carrying scars. It doesn't surprise me if some of yours echo off the walls." Grace didn't answer, but she didn't dismiss it either. That afternoon, she called Laura Kim from a borrowed phone at the library in town. It had been a week since they last spoke. "Hey, Laura. I was wondering, do you know if my grandfather had any kind of business holdings, stocks, land other than this place?" There was a pause. "That's a broad question." Why, Grace hesitated. "Just found some old papers. Nothing fancy. Just curious." "Grace, I looked over Walter Walker's estate years ago when your mother passed. It was all very minimal. No accounts, no portfolios. Just this property and a few thousand in savings. Why, I'll let you know if I find anything interesting." Grace said, "Would you be willing to take a look if I bring something in?" "Of course." Grace hung up the question, echoing in her mind if her grandfather didn't leave behind any assets. What exactly was behind that wall? That night, the storm came. It didn't creep in. It slammed into Everbrook with a fury that rattled the glass and howled through the trees. Rain hammered the roof, sleet slicked the windows, and the wind howled around the house like it was trying to peel the paint from the walls. Grace made a fire in the stove and pulled Sophie close, layering blankets and singing soft lullabies over the storm's roar. Sophie didn't cry. She just held her rabbit close and whispered, "We're safe here, right?" Grace kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby. We're safe." But her own heart didn't believe it, because under the crack of thunder and the groan of the house she heard it again, a sound that didn't belong. From below. The crash came around midnight. Not loud, but heavy. Like something falling, or something breaking free. Grace stood, flashlight already in her hand. She stared at the basement door for a long time before she opened it. She didn't call Noah. Didn't wait for daylight. Because something in her had shifted. The fear was still there, but now it burned next to curiosity. She descended the stairs with slow, measured steps, and when she reached the bottom, she saw it. The wall had given way. A section of bricks had collapsed inward, scattered across the floor like broken teeth, and behind them, a void, a gap, a dark, narrow space where no space should have been. Grace stepped closer, flashlight beam trembling, and what it revealed made her breath catch in her throat. Not bones, not rot, but steel. Old, dust-covered, with a handle so ornate it looked out of place in the crumbling basement. A safe. Just sitting there, waiting. She swallowed, knelt beside it, and reached for the handle. It turned, unlocked, and she froze. Because whatever was in that safe wasn't just going to change the house. It was going to change everything. Grace sat motionless in front of the safe, her breath rising in shallow, icy clouds. The flashlight beam danced across the surface, revealing a faded brass emblem on the door, H. Stetson & Sons, 1893. It looked like something out of a museum, heavy-weathered and absurdly elegant for a basement that smelled like mildew and wet concrete. She placed a trembling hand on the curved handle again. It turned smooth and quiet like it had been waiting for decades for this exact moment. The door creaked open. Inside was no booby trap, no bones, no horror. Just silence. And dust. She lifted the flashlight and leaned in. Papers. Dozens of them, neatly stacked in yellowing manila folders. A dark velvet pouch. A leather ledger, its corners cracked with age. And beneath it all, something gleamed faintly, catching the beam like a secret, finally seeing daylight again. Grace reached in and pulled out the top item, a stock certificate ornate and watermarked with a wax seal near the corner. Rocky Mountain Mining Consortium. Certificate of Ownership, 5,000 shares. Her heart skipped. She stared at the numbers, then the date, April 3rd, 1956. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was valuable. She grabbed more papers. Land deeds, mineral rights claims, handwritten notes in an old-school looping script. The names listed matched her grandfather's. Walter R. Walker was scrawled over several documents, each marked with corporate stamps and notarized seals. She flipped open the ledger. It was dense rows and rows of numbers, transactions, inventory logs, and what appeared to be mining output tallies. Some pages were tabbed, others dog-eared. A note was scribbled across the inside cover. If you're reading this, your family. And if your family, the truth is finally yours. She exhaled sharply and sat back on her heels. This wasn't just a stash, it was a legacy. But why had no one known? Why had her mother never mentioned it? Why had her grandfather sealed it behind a wall and buried it beneath decades of dust and silence? She stood her legs shaky. Her mind raced. Because no one was supposed to find it. Because someone had tried to erase it. Because this was worth hiding. And if it was worth hiding, it was worth a lot. No one hides this much unless it meant everything, she muttered. Grace gathered the documents with care, wrapping them in a blanket before carrying them upstairs. She didn't want Sophie to see yet. This wasn't something a child should hold before she understood what it meant. She laid the bundle on the kitchen table and stared at it, the full weight of it pressing on her chest like a second heartbeat. It didn't take long for Noah to arrive. He knocked once before walking in, saw the look on her face, and froze. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked. Grace nodded slowly. Behind the wall, a safe. It wasn't locked. She peeled the blanket back and showed him the stock certificate. He leaned in, whistling low. "That's not just a document. That's ownership. Depending on the current value of that company, this could be—" "I don't know," Grace said. "A lot." He picked up the ledger and thumbed through it. This kind of record-keeping, someone cared deeply about this. "You think your grandfather ran part of the company?" "I don't know," she repeated. "But I'm going to find out." That afternoon, she called Laura Kim again and asked for a meeting. She packed everything into a waterproof bag, dressed Sophie warmly, and drove Noah's truck into Helena, the closest city, with a real legal office and a clean cafe to meet. Laura greeted her with a sharp look and a raised brow. "You sounded urgent." Grace sat down, unzipped the bag, and laid out the documents like playing cards in a high-stakes game. "I found these in a hidden safe in my grandfather's house. Can you tell me what I'm sitting on?" Laura adjusted her glasses and leaned in. As she scanned the documents, her posture straightened. The room seemed to go quieter, denser. "This is not just memorabilia, Grace. These are legal and financial documents, real ones. This," she held up the stock certificate, "could be worth a fortune. Depending on the current standing of the company, the number of active shares, and whether these have ever been cashed or transferred." Grace nodded, her throat dry. "And if they haven't, then you could be the legal holder of shares in a company that's likely grown exponentially since 1956, depending on what Rocky Mountain mining became." "I want you to find out," Grace said. "Please." Laura nodded. "I will. This is serious, Grace. The kind of serious that doesn't stay secret for long. I'll get my research started right away." On the drive back to Everbrook, Sophie played with her rabbit in the back seat, humming softly. Grace's mind swirled. Every bump in the road seemed heavier now. Every turn felt like crossing into a new life she didn't ask for, but one she could no longer ignore. That night, as the house creaked and shifted around her, Grace couldn't sleep. She laid awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much truth her grandfather had buried behind that wall, and why he'd chosen to leave it to her of all people. The old man who never said much, who always kept his eyes on the ground and his secrets to himself. He hadn't left her a goodbye, but he'd left her this, and that meant something. By morning, her phone buzzed. It was Laura. Grace answered immediately. "What did you find?" There was a pause on the line. Then Laura spoke slowly, carefully. "Grace, you need to sit down." Grace sat at the edge of her mattress, fingers clutching the worn blanket. The Rocky Mountain Mining Consortium. Laura said merged with two larger companies in the 80s. One of them went public in 1994. Today they're operating under the name RMMC Resources. Their current market value is just under $800 million. Grace couldn't breathe. Laura continued. Based on the original stock structure and adjusted splits, those 5,000 shares translate to 3.2% of the company. If the certificate holds up, and legally I believe it does, you are the owner of roughly $25 million. Maybe more depending on the week. The room tilted. Grace pressed a hand to her chest. Are you still there? Laura asked. I'm here, Grace whispered. You need to come in again, with everything. And Grace, yeah. Don't tell anyone else, not yet. As the call ended, Grace sat in silence, her ears ringing, her fingers numb. 25 million. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel possible. But it was. And now she understood why the wall had been sealed, why the past had been buried. Because this wasn't just inheritance. It was a landmine. She looked toward the basement door. What else had he hidden down there? And more importantly, who else knew? The next morning, Grace stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her hair was tied back, her skin pale, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, and something more, fear maybe, or disbelief. She rinsed her face with cold water and gripped the edges of the sink, grounding herself. $25 million. That number had haunted her sleep, throbbed like a second heartbeat behind her eyes. It had followed her like a ghost into every room, every thought. Her grandfather's safe had changed everything, but not in the way she'd expected. Not yet. It wasn't freedom, not yet. It was danger disguised as salvation. After she dressed and made breakfast for Sophie, she packed up the documents and wrapped them in plastic, hiding them under a loose floorboard beneath her bed. She hadn't told Noah. She hadn't even told Sophie what she'd found. She'd only told Laura, and Laura had been clear, keep it quiet. But secrets had a smell. They seeped into the walls and made the air taste sharp. And Grace had the feeling deep in her gut that someone somewhere had already picked up the scent. That feeling solidified when she opened the front door and saw the black SUV parked at the edge of the property. Not a pickup like most locals drove. Not a rusted van from the county. This was sleek, spotless, and completely out of place. A man stood beside it, dressed in dark jeans and a pressed flannel, too clean to be real. He wasn't from Everbrook. He wasn't from anywhere nearby. He smiled as she stepped outside. Grace Walker. Her voice didn't waver. Can I help you? He extended a business card. My name is Martin Croft. I represent a group with interest in rural property restoration. We've been tracking parcels with historical significance in Montana. Your grandfather's land came up on our radar. Grace didn't take the card. You're looking to buy, possibly, if you're willing to entertain offers. Grace folded her arms. The house isn't for sale. Croft's smile didn't shift. Understandable, but I'd love the chance to walk the land. Maybe discuss potential partnerships. Some of our clients are preservationists. This land has value, both historical and perhaps geological. There it was. Geological. He knew. Not everything. But enough. Her blood chilled. I'm not interested in selling. Or partnerships. Croft gave a small, polite nod, like he'd expected the refusal. If you change your mind, my number's on the card. He placed it on the porch rail, tipped his head, and returned to the SUV. The engine purred like a predator, and then he was gone. Grace picked up the card, turned it over. No website. No physical office. Just a phone number and a clean serif logo, Croft Holdings. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, heart hammering. They were coming. Whoever they were. Later that afternoon, Noah arrived with Sophie's school registration forms and a crate of salvaged wood. "You okay?" he asked, pausing as he handed her the papers. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired." But her voice gave something away. Noah looked at her a second too long. "You sure?" She hesitated again, and this time it cracked. "A man came by this morning, said he wanted to buy the property, called it geologically significant." Noah's jaw tensed. "Did he say who he worked for Croft Holdings?" Noah frowned. "Never heard of them. But that doesn't mean much. Land sharks change names like socks." She stepped back, letting him inside. He knew too much. Not everything. But enough to scare me. "Did you tell him anything?" "No." He nodded. "Good. Don't. These types, they get wind of buried value and they'll do anything to pry it loose." Grace swallowed. "I didn't tell you the whole truth the other day. About what I found." She told him then about the stock, the mineral rights, the safe, the valuation. About Laura's call. About the way the documents were still legally intact. He didn't flinch. "Damn," he muttered when she finished. "That's a hell of a secret to carry. I didn't want to drag you into it." He gave her a sharp look. Too late. They sat at the table, the house creaking softly around them. Sophie played quietly in the next room, humming under her breath. The quiet felt tight, pressurized. Grace Noah said finally, "People don't let that kind of money walk away, especially people who think it should have been theirs." She nodded slowly. "I think someone already knew about the safe. Maybe not what was inside, but enough to start circling." Noah tapped his fingers on the table. "Then we need to do two things. First, we protect the documents. Don't keep them all here. Split them. Maybe a safety deposit box. Maybe with Laura. And the second thing, we find out who Croft really is." Grace exhaled. "You know anyone who can dig into that?" He paused. "Yeah, I do." That night, Grace couldn't sleep again. Sophie was safe, tucked in, rabbit clutched to her chest. The stove still breathed heat into the air. But Grace's thoughts spun. She lay in bed, staring at the dark rafters above her ears, tuned to every creak of the house. Then she heard it. A soft click. Not from inside. From outside. The porch. She moved fast, barefoot, heartbeat thudding, flashlight in hand. She reached the front door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. But when she opened the door and stepped outside, her blood turned to ice. On the porch rail where Croft had left his card, a single rock now sat in its place. Flat, white, scratched, a symbol carved crudely into the surface. She picked it up, turned it. The back was scorched like it had been burned. Grace stared out into the night, searching the tree line, the driveway, the darkness. Nothing moved. But someone had been here, and they wanted her to know it. Back inside, she locked every window and door. She checked on Sophie twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table, the rock in her hand, and whispered to the room. "Secrets don't stay buried. Not when they're worth this much." In the morning, she would meet someone from Noah's past. Someone who could trace Croft. Dig through the fake names, the paper trails, the shell companies. But tonight, she finally understood this wasn't about land. It wasn't even about money. It was about something deeper, something old. And someone was willing to come for it. Hard. From now on, she had to protect more than just her daughter. She had to protect a legacy, even if it meant going to war for it. The wind howled down from the mountains the next morning, carrying with it a cold that cut sharper than usual. Grace stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, eyes locked on the porch, where the rock still sat from last night. She hadn't thrown it away. She hadn't even touched it again. It was a message. But from who and why now? Noah arrived early. He looked more serious than usual, dressed in a canvas coat and worn boots, his beard unshaven like he hadn't slept either. "You ready?" he asked. Grace nodded. "What are we walking into?" "Someone who owes me. Someone who's good with digging through shadows." They didn't bring Sophie. Delilah had agreed to watch her for the day, promising crafts and cookies and warmth. Grace hesitated, leaving her behind, but one look into Delilah's steady eyes was enough to let go for now. They drove out past town, deeper into the pines. The road narrowed until it was barely a trail, ice-crusted in the tire ruts. After 20 minutes, the trees gave way to a clearing, and at its edge stood a lone structure, half cabin, half bunker. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and 2 deer watched them from a frozen stream nearby, unmoving like stone sentinels. "Noah killed the engine. He doesn't talk much." Grace smirked. "Why am I not surprised?" Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled of pine resin and black coffee. The man who stepped out of the back room looked like someone built from the woods themselves, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with fingers stained from ink or oil. "Grace, this is Will Hardy," Noah said. "Will meet the granddaughter of Walter Walker." Will nodded once. "Your grandfather was a smart man. Quiet, but smart." "You knew him?" Will shrugged. "Worked on a few projects together. Back when mining companies were still trying to buy up this part of Montana." Grace's breath caught. So he was involved in something big. Will sat down at a table cluttered with maps, folders, and an open laptop. Bigger than anyone knew, and smarter than all of them. Walter didn't trust banks, didn't trust lawyers, didn't trust corporations either. That's why his name is on those documents, and not a single soul outside this valley knew. Grace pulled the stock certificate from her coat and slid it across the table. "They know now. Someone named Martin Croft came to the house yesterday." Will's fingers froze over his keyboard. "That name's not new." He pulled up a database typed with speed and precision. Within seconds, names and shell companies filled the screen. He clicked through, tracing paper trails like they were veins in a body. "Croft Holdings is a front," he said. "Registered under 3 different shell companies, none of which have public ownership data. But here, look at this." He pointed to a name buried in a SEC filing from 2011. Red Creek Minerals. They filed suit over land rights in Nevada. Lost. But their lead consultant. He clicked again. Martin Croft. Grace leaned closer. "So he's not just some real estate broker." "No, he's an acquisition hound. Works for people who mine first and ask questions later. And if he's here in Everbrook, it's not by chance someone sent him." Grace's voice was low. "Because of what's in that safe." Will nodded. "He wouldn't come unless someone believed what's on that land is real. Not just the ownership rights. I'm talking active reserves, unextracted material, oil, lithium, rare earth, you name it." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I don't want the money. I want to protect it. For Sophie. For what it means." Will gave her a long look. "Then you need to make this bigger than him. Right now it's one man. But if you don't act fast, he'll bring lawyers. He'll challenge the documentation. He'll drag it into federal court where companies like his thrive. But if you get public interest, if you make it about history, preservation, legacy, he loses ground. Noah leaned against the wall. So what do? Will opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. You do what Walter should have done 40 years ago. Grace opened the folder. Inside were copies of geological surveys, old press releases, handwritten letters from Walter, and local land maps. She flipped through, eyes wide. You had this all along, Will nodded. Your grandfather trusted me with it. He told me if anyone ever came looking with bad intentions, I'd know what to do. Grace looked up, her voice trembling. And what's that? Will said it plainly. You don't fight men like Croft with fists. You fight them with truth so loud it echoes. The phrase hit her like a bell rung deep in her ribs. Truth so loud it echoes. She looked at the papers again and saw it clearly now. What Walter had hidden wasn't just wealth. It was proof, history, something powerful men had tried to bury. And now someone wanted to bury it again. Will copied the contents of the folder to a flash drive, then looked at Grace. You need to go public. Press, historical foundations, hell, even social media. You need light, Grace. That's the only thing they can't fight in the dark. She nodded, gripping the flash drive like a weapon. Then I'll start tonight. As they drove back, Grace stared out the window, heart pounding with a different kind of fear, now not of being hunted, but of stepping into something far bigger than herself. She wasn't ready, but she was willing. Back at the farmhouse, Sophie ran into her arms, eyes bright from playing, and cheeks flushed from laughter. For a second, Grace let herself just hold her. Just be a mother. But that moment passed quickly. Because taped to the front door under a rock, just like the one from yesterday, was a single page torn from a newspaper. It was folded in half, but she could already see the headline, Walker Family Land May Hold Untapped Fortune Experts Claim. Her stomach dropped. She tore the page off, flipped it over, and froze. A photo of her and Sophie taken from across the yard, without their knowledge. Her hands shook. She looked toward the tree line. No one. But someone had been watching. And now it was no longer a game. Now it was a warning. She stepped inside, locked the door, and looked at Noah. It's already started. He nodded grimly. Then we better hit back before they hit harder. Because once the secret was out, there was no going back. And Grace understood that better than anyone now. The next 24 hours unfolded like a storm Grace couldn't step out of. The article had been published online, shared in local circles, then picked up by a regional news site. It was vague, based on rumors citing anonymous local sources. But it was enough. Enough to draw attention. Enough to make Croft and whoever he worked for realize they weren't the only ones chasing the truth now. By morning, 2 different cars had driven past the house. Slowly. Windows tinted. Plates obscured by snow or dust. Grace wrote down every detail, snapped blurry photos, and forwarded them to Will. Noah stayed close. Delilah, too. She brought extra food, more blankets, and a hunting rifle she said belonged to her late husband. Grace didn't ask questions. She just accepted the weight of it and leaned it beside the front door. Sophie noticed the change in energy. She was quieter, her usual hum of curiosity dulled. Are the bad people coming? She asked that night, curled up on Grace's lap. Grace kissed the top of her head and whispered, They're already here, baby, but they won't get past us. Still, Grace knew words could only protect so much. Action had to follow. So she took the next step. That morning, dressed in clean jeans and a wool coat, she drove to Helena again, this time without Sophie. Will had emailed her a press kit, scanned documents, historical analysis maps, and copies of the ownership claims. He'd written a detailed breakdown naming Walter Walker as a key local figure in Montana's mining preservation history. It wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was a narrative, one the media could bite into. Grace sat across from a local journalist, Lizzie Morrow, at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Lizzie had sharp eyes and a notebook filled with scribbles. "Off the record first," Grace asked. Lizzie nodded. "Until you say otherwise." Grace laid out everything carefully, cautiously. Not about the full value. Not yet. But enough to spark interest. Enough to shift the pressure back onto Croft's side. Lizzie tapped her pen. "You're saying a single mom found historical mining documentation hidden for decades that might impact mineral rights across the region?" Grace sipped her coffee. "I'm saying my grandfather left behind something important, and now people are showing up who want to pretend it doesn't exist." Lizzie smiled, eyes gleaming. "This is gold, literally and figuratively." "Print whatever you want," Grace said, "as long as my daughter's name stays out of it." Lizzie nodded. "Deal. But just know, once this story's out, there's no putting it back." "I know," Grace said softly, "but it's already too late for silence." That night the article dropped. It wasn't sensational. It was factual, well-sourced, and bold. It quoted local historians. It mentioned Walter by name. It included a photo of the land, a copy of the deed, and a redacted scan of the stock certificate. It didn't accuse Croft directly, but it made clear that unnamed acquisition agents had been seen on the property. Within hours, Grace's inbox was flooded. Lawyers, journalists, strangers, even a producer from a documentary channel left a voicemail. "We'd love to speak with you about developing a series around your family's legacy." Grace ignored most of them. She wasn't chasing fame. She was drawing a line. Noah leaned against the porch that night, scanning the tree line as Grace joined him. "You sure this was the right move?" he asked. Grace nodded. They were already closing in. Now at least they have to do it in the light. He looked over at her, his face unreadable. "And if they don't care about the light?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because just then headlights appeared in the distance. Not slow this time. Not discreet. A pickup barreled down the road and skidded to a stop just before the gate. Grace tensed. Noah reached for the rifle, but the door opened and a woman stepped out. Tall, blonde, sharp-shouldered and dressed like she'd just walked out of a courtroom, not a ranch road. She walked up to the fence with authority. "I'm looking for Grace Walker," she called. Grace stepped forward. "Who's asking? I'm Victoria Croft, Martin's sister, and legal counsel for Croft Holdings." The last name hit like ice down Grace's spine. "I'm not interested in deals," Grace said flatly. Victoria smiled like a shark. "Oh, I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to warn you." Noah stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You threatening her?" "Of course not," Victoria said sweetly. "But I am informing her that as of this morning we've filed a claim disputing the authenticity of the stock certificate. We're requesting an injunction to freeze any further press about it until ownership is resolved in court." Grace's fists clenched. "You're trying to silence the truth." "We're trying to protect our investments," Victoria said. "And I suggest you stop digging. You're not going to like what you find." With that, she turned, got in her truck, and drove off into the dark. Noah cursed under his breath. They're pushing hard now. Grace stared after the taillights until they disappeared. Then she said, almost to herself, if they're scared of what's buried, then maybe I haven't dug deep enough. Later that night, she and Noah returned to the basement. The bricks still lay scattered from where she'd broken through. The safe was empty now. But Grace brought the flashlight and began sweeping every inch of the space, crawling, tapping walls, checking corners. Noah watched her quiet at first, until she paused at a far end of the basement, a spot with a floorboard slightly warped, like water had once pushed up beneath it. She knelt and pried it loose. Below it wasn't dirt. It was wood, and a small iron latch, another compartment. She pulled it open, and a wave of musty air rose up like a held breath. Inside was a box, not large, but heavy, locked. Noah handed her his pocketknife. She flipped the latch. Inside the box was a stack of letters, a faded photograph, and a journal wrapped in twine. The photo made her breath catch. Walter Walker Younger standing beside a man Grace didn't recognize, and behind them a mine shaft entrance marked with the name Sable Ridge. Grace flipped open the journal. The first page read, "If they ever find this, tell them I never sold. I never bowed. I never let them take what was ours." She looked at Noah, her voice shaking. "This goes deeper than land. They tried to erase him." Noah nodded. "Then we tell the world who he really was," and Grace, clutching the journal to her chest, knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air in the basement had grown still. The dust swirled in Grace's flashlight beam as she stared down at the journal in her hands. Walter's handwriting stretched across the brittle pages in neat looping lines. Each word was deliberate, like he'd known someone would read them long after he was gone. "If they ever find this, tell them I never sold. I never bowed. I never let them take what was ours." Grace whispered it aloud, the words catching in her throat. Walter hadn't just hidden evidence. He had recorded a battle, one that had never ended, only shifted to her shoulders. Noah stood over her shoulder, flashlight aimed at the pages. "What else does it say?" She flipped through slowly. Walter had chronicled meetings with corporate suits from out of state, offers that turned into threats, letters that vanished, legal documents that were altered or lost. One name appeared more than once. Croft. Not just Martin. Decades ago it had been their father, Thomas Croft. The bloodline hadn't changed, just the faces. "They tried to break him," Grace murmured, "and when they couldn't, they erased him." Noah crouched beside her. "And now they're trying to do the same to you." Grace closed the journal, her hands steady now. "Then we do what he couldn't. We fight back loud. We make sure no one can erase us this time." She brought the journal and the photograph upstairs and placed them next to the ledger and stock certificates. Each piece was more than evidence. It was legacy, defiance, memory. It was armor. That night, Grace sent scans of the journal to Will and Laura. She called Lizzie, told her there was more to the story. Real names, real crimes, real history. The next morning, a second article hit the press. This time, it didn't just mention potential mineral rights. It exposed the Croft family's history of pressure tactics, illegal acquisitions, and harassment of landowners throughout the western states. It quoted Walter's journal. It named names. And it painted Grace not as a woman caught in scandal, but as the granddaughter of a man who'd tried to protect his community from corporate greed and who had paid for it with silence. By noon, Grace's phone was ringing non-stop. TV news vans were parked just outside the property line. Protesters began gathering, holding signs that read, "Protect Montana's land and justice for Walter." Noah paced the porch with a rifle slung across his chest. "We stirred the hornet's nest," he said. Grace watched the growing crowd, her heart torn between pride and dread. Good. Let them swarm. That night, as the moon rose over the ridge, headlights appeared again. But this time the car didn't stop at the gate. It drove straight up the driveway. Noah lifted the rifle. Grace stepped beside him. The car door opened. A man in a tailored coat stepped out. Not Croft. Another. Older. Thinner. His face drawn tight with familiarity. Grace Walker. Who are you? He paused, then stepped forward. My name is Samuel Trask. I was your grandfather's lawyer, and I think you and I need to talk. Grace glanced at Noah. You knew Walter very well, and I have something for you. From his coat, he pulled a thick envelope and handed it over. Grace opened it slowly, finding a notarized document and a set of blueprints. What is this? Walter anticipated this might happen one day. He left instructions for you if the land was ever threatened. That, Samuel said, nodding at the papers, is a protective trust. He placed the mineral rights under it before he passed, and named you the sole executor. Grace blinked. So they can't take it. Not legally, no. But they'll try. She looked down at the plans. They weren't for mining. They were for preservation. A wildlife sanctuary. Walter hadn't just protected the land. He'd tried to save it. He wanted to build this, she whispered. He wanted the land to breathe again. Samuel nodded. And now it's yours to finish. The emotion rose hot and fast in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She turned to Noah. We make this public. Every part of it. He gave her a firm nod. Samuel hesitated. There's one more thing. He reached into his coat and pulled out an old cassette tape. Walter recorded something. He didn't trust writing it all down. He said, some truths were meant to be heard. Grace took it in her hands, unsure whether it felt like a key or a warning. I don't have a tape player, she said. Noah smiled faintly. I do. They went inside. Sophie had already fallen asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, but tension crackled through the walls. Noah dug through a dusty cabinet and produced a small tape deck. He popped the cassette in and pressed play. At first there was static, then Walter's voice. Rough, measured, steady. If you're hearing this, then they've come back. And if they've come back, then the lies didn't die with me. Grace sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest. Walter spoke of everything. The intimidation, the secret meetings, the offers, the threats, the reason he sealed the documents away. They weren't just after land, his voice said. They were after control, generational wealth, and the only way to stop them is to expose them root and stem. The tape ended with a single sentence. You don't inherit silence, Grace. You inherit the fight. She sat still for a long time after it stopped. Then she stood, her voice low but filled with fire. Then I'll finish what you started. Because it was no longer just about Walter. It was about justice. And this time they wouldn't bury the truth. They'd bury the ones who tried to silence it. And as dawn crept toward the horizon, Grace knew the next move would have to be bold. It was time to step into the public arena, and it was time to name the enemy outright. The morning Grace decided to go public with everything. She didn't bother checking the forecast. The sky was already heavy with dark clouds, as if Montana itself knew what was coming. The chill cut deeper than the weather. It was the kind of cold that came with risk, one that whispered, once you say this, there's no going back. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair into something passable. Sophie sat at the kitchen table coloring while Noah went over the morning press contacts on his phone. "You don't have to do this today," he said, not looking up. "I do," Grace replied, voice calm but hard, "before they have time to rewrite the story again." Noah pushed his phone aside. "Once you go live with this, you're a target in every direction. They'll discredit you. Drag Walter's name through the mud. Question everything." Grace zipped up her coat and looked him in the eye. "Then let them come. I'm not hiding anymore." He nodded slowly. "Then we make sure they hear you loud." They drove to town in silence, Sophie staying behind with Delilah for safety. Grace's hands tightened on the folder in her lap, scanned Deed's photos, a printed transcript of Walter's audio message, and the blueprint for the sanctuary. The town hall had been rented for a press conference. Will had arranged a few credible outlets. But word had spread and the room was packed, reporters, activists, locals, some familiar faces from the protest signs now holding cell phones. Grace stepped to the podium as the cameras lit up. Her heart thudded once, twice, then evened out as she drew in a breath and said, "My name is Grace Walker, and I'm here to tell the truth that's been buried for decades." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "My grandfather, Walter Walker, was not just a landowner. He was a protector, a man who stood against powerful forces when they tried to claim something that didn't belong to them. And they punished him for it, not with bullets or bars, but with silence." She held up the photo of Walter and the journal, then set them on the podium. Then the deed. Then the blueprint. One by one, she laid them out like evidence in court. They told him the land was worthless. Then they spent decades trying to steal it. And now that I've found what he left behind, what he fought to preserve, they're coming again. But this time I'm ready. A reporter raised a hand. "Are you suggesting Croft Holdings engaged in generational fraud?" Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying it outright." Gasps, flashes. Another reporter leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Grace held up the journal. "In Walter's words, in their own contracts, and in a recording he made before he died." She paused, her voice steady but fierce. "You see, secrets don't stay buried forever. And when truth is stronger than fear, you dig until you hit the root." The quote echoed across the room like a crack of thunder. When truth is stronger than fear, you dig until you hit the root. After a few more questions, Grace stepped down her legs, shaking beneath her calm exterior. Noah was already waiting in the hallway, watching her with guarded pride. "You nailed it," he said. "I had to." Will caught up with them, face glowing. "That was everything. It's going to blow wide open." "Let it," Grace replied. "No more shadows." They didn't make it 5 steps outside before the first pushback hit. A man in a suit, clean-shaven, sunglasses, despite the clouds, stepped into their path and flashed a badge. "Grace Walker, yes. I'm Agent Monroe, Federal Land and Resource Management. I need to speak to you about a potential violation of federal mineral right claims associated with Parcel 4C, your property." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Let me guess." Croft called in a favor. Monroe didn't blink. "I'm not at liberty to discuss private complaints, but I need to ask that you cease all media dissemination until the investigation is concluded." Noah took a step forward. "She has every legal right to speak." Grace, however, smiled calmly. "You go ahead and do your investigation. Just make sure you read everything before you draw a line through my family's name." Monroe handed her a letter and left without further comment. Will read the document. "It's flimsy. A stall tactic." "They're getting desperate," Grace said. "Which means we're close." Back at the house, Sophie was waiting with wide eyes. "Mommy, are the bad guys mad?" Grace knelt down beside her. "Maybe. But that's because the truth makes bad people scared." Sophie nodded like she understood more than her age allowed. "Good. I want them to be scared." That night, the sanctuary plan went viral. Will had posted it alongside a digital version of Walter's audio. Social media took hold like wildfire. From greed to green, someone captioned it. News anchors discussed it, podcasters debated it, and Croft Holdings issued a vague denial without naming Grace, but everyone knew who they meant. Delilah brought soup and whiskey. "You made them squirm," she said, raising her glass. Grace clinked it. "They made me run. Now I'm done running." But as the fire in the hearth burned and the house settled into uneasy quiet, a sudden flicker at the window made Noah freeze. He moved silently to the window. Outside, a black SUV sat at the edge of the woods. Engine running. Headlights off. Noah didn't move. "They're watching us now." Grace joined him, looking out. "Good," she whispered. Then she turned to him, eyes sharp as blades. "Tomorrow we take this to the next level." "What's that mean?" "It means we don't wait for them to strike again. We show them what we found beneath Sable Ridge." Noah frowned. "You think it's safe to go there?" "It's not about safe anymore," Grace replied. "It's about finishing what Walter started. And I have a feeling we haven't found the deepest part yet." As she stood in the window's shadow, watching the SUV fade into the forest like a ghost, Grace's mind was already there underground, following the map, chasing what her grandfather died protecting. The past was calling, and this time she was ready to answer it. Rain slicked the rocks under Grace's boots as she moved through the overgrowth toward the entrance of the old mine at Sable Ridge. Trees loomed like sentinels, the mist curling around their trunks. Noah trailed just behind her headlamp, slicing through the early morning fog. Every step brought them deeper into the shadow of the past. They'd left Sophie with Delilah before dawn, slipping away before anyone could stop them. There was no press this time. No lawyer, no backup. Just them and the truth Walter had buried beneath the mountain. "You sure this is it?" Noah asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Grace pulled Walter's hand-drawn map from the waterproof bag under her coat. The lines now etched in her memory matched the slope they were climbing. "This is where the old access shaft should be," she said, scanning the terrain. After a few more feet, she found it an overgrown clearing behind a collapsed fence. A rusted metal grate, half buried in earth and moss, marked the entrance. "Looks like it hasn't been touched in decades," Noah muttered. Grace knelt beside it. "Until now." They pried the grate loose, then descended slowly, flashlights bouncing along the crumbling walls of the shaft. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of earth and old secrets. Wooden beams lined the walls. Some groaned under their weight, warped with time. Grace ran her fingers along them, feeling their cold resistance. Walter's notes had been cryptic. He'd referred to the hollow chamber beneath the vein. It hadn't made sense until she remembered the markings on the blueprint. A secondary tunnel never used for mining. Hidden on purpose. After 20 minutes of winding paths and side passages, Grace found it. A narrow tunnel branching away from the main shaft, partially bricked over. Her flashlight caught a faded red X painted above the opening. Noah raised his brows. Subtle. She took a deep breath, then started removing the bricks. When they stepped through, the air changed. It was colder. Still. The beam of her light cut across a wide chamber carved directly into the stone. And at its center sat something she hadn't dared imagine, a steel vault door bolted into the rock. Noah whistled. "What the hell?" Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding. The vault looked untouched. No signs of tampering. She reached for the old combination lock and paused. Walter had left a sequence in his journal, numbers that had seemed out of place until now. Her fingers turned the dial. Click, click, click. The vault opened with a long, aching hiss. Inside a small chamber, and within it, rows of filing cabinets, a fireproof safe, and in the center, a wooden crate wrapped in cloth. Noah reached for the papers in one cabinet and started flipping through them. These are land transfers, records of every buyout attempt, all signed, all notarized. Grace opened the crate. Inside were more stock certificates, far more than what she had upstairs. And at the bottom, an envelope marked in red ink, "Do not destroy." She opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, meetings in dark rooms, handshakes with local officials, signatures on documents that clearly violated existing conservation laws. And in the corner of nearly every photo, Thomas Croft, his son Martin in a few. They weren't just trying to buy out the town. They were trying to bury the law itself. Grace's fingers trembled as she held up the photos to Noah. This is it. This is what Walter died to hide. Noah nodded grimly. And what they're still trying to keep buried. Grace scanned the documents, seeing names she recognized. Judges, council members, even former senators. All tied to Croft Holdings. The network of power was wider than she imagined. She found a recording device tucked into a drawer, an old microcassette player, and a tape labeled "Final Testimony." She hit play. Walter's voice came through again. Weaker this time, more deliberate. "I don't know if this will ever reach the light, but if it does, let them know. The truth isn't just in the lies they told. It's in the silence they bought, the silence they forced." The tape continued, laying out years of illegal transactions, falsified environmental impact reports, and blackmail schemes. When it ended, Grace looked at Noah and said the words that had echoed in her chest from the moment she found the first letter. Some things were never meant to stay buried. Noah looked around the chamber. "This is enough to bring down the whole damn company." Grace nodded. "And maybe more." They photographed everything, every document, every photo. Then carefully packed up the originals into waterproof bags. When they emerged from the mine hours later, the world above had changed. Police vehicles lined the property. A crowd of reporters stood behind the tape cameras, raised like weapons. Will was there, waving frantically. "What's going on?" Grace called as they stepped into the open. Will rushed forward. "They've filed a federal injunction. They're trying to seize the property as a national interest site to protect a strategic mineral reserve." Grace laughed bitterly. "They're trying to paint themselves as environmental saviors now." Will held up a printout. "It's already hit the news cycle. They're flipping the narrative again. You need to show them what you found. Now." Grace looked at Noah, then down at the pack slung over her shoulder. "Get a mic," she said to Will. "Right now." 15 minutes later, she stood in front of the cameras again, soaked from the mountain rain mud on her boots, hair wild from the wind. She raised the folder high. "Croft Holdings claims this land is theirs, that they're protecting it for future generations. But I'm standing here with proof they've been poisoning this land for decades, poisoning the truth, the courts, and the people." She held up a photograph. "This is Thomas Croft bribing a state official to fake environmental reports. Here's Martin Croft forging signatures to take land that didn't belong to him. And here she raised the microcassette recorder. Is my grandfather's final testimony exposing it all?" Gasps, flashes, questions, shouts. She didn't flinch. This isn't just about land. It's about the soul of this place, and I won't let them sell it." Behind her, Noah stood like a sentinel, and in the silence that followed her words, it became clear to everyone watching the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, the tide had turned, and in the shadows of old crimes, something new was beginning to take shape, something honest. What Grace didn't know was that Croft Holdings wasn't going down without its own final strike, and it was already in motion. The day the indictment came down the sky over Coldridge was clear for the first time in weeks. Not a cloud in sight. Just crisp air and the kind of quiet that comes when a storm has passed, but the world hasn't quite caught its breath. Grace sat on the porch, coffee going cold in her hands, as she listened to the radio announcer say the words she had dreamed of hearing. Martin Croft, CEO of Croft Holdings, was taken into federal custody this morning, following a months-long investigation. Charges include conspiracy to defraud, environmental violations, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The words played like music, and yet she felt no joy, no celebration, just a steady, quiet weight lifting off her chest, slow, deliberate, like the mountain itself had exhaled. Noah stepped outside and leaned on the railing beside her. "It's done." "Almost," Grace said softly. "The fight's won, but the healing's just starting." She looked out across the field now dotted with young trees. Volunteers had come every week to help restore what had been damaged. Some were strangers, others neighbors. She thought she'd lost. Delilah had taken the lead organizing the efforts. Even Lizzie had shown up with gloves and a shovel. The sanctuary was real now, not just a blueprint or a dream in Walter's journals. Fencing had gone up. Wildlife corridors were being restored. The press had shifted its spotlight elsewhere, and the land had a chance to breathe again. But the scars were still there on the land and in her. She rose and walked down to the field boots, crunching over damp soil. At the far edge stood a wooden sign freshly carved, "The Walter Walker Sanctuary for Truth and Restoration." She traced the letters with her fingers, then stepped aside as Sophie came running up the hill. "Mom, come see the fox." Sophie had grown bolder in the past weeks, the fear in her eyes replaced with curiosity and light. Grace followed her to a small, brush-covered knoll, where sure enough a fox darted through the wee weeds, its rust-colored tail flashing like a firework. "She comes back every morning," Sophie whispered, "like she knows it's safe now." Grace smiled. Maybe she does. Later that afternoon, Grace met Will and Laura back at Town Hall, papers in hand. Today wasn't just about closing a chapter, it was about opening something permanent. "This is the last of it," Will said, sliding over the final documents. "The non-profit status is approved. Full protection under federal conservation law. Mineral rights included." Laura tapped her pen thoughtfully. "There's a lot of interest from educational foundations. You could turn the homestead into a learning center. Let Walter's legacy teach future generations." Grace considered it for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes. But not just Walter's story. All of it. The truth. The cost, the silence." She looked at the framed newspaper on the wall beside them. The headline read, "Land Lies and the Woman Who Fought Back." She never asked for that title, but now she carried it proudly.